This podcast is presented to you by the Center for Writing and Communication, Ashoka University.
Welcome to a new episode of Back to the Tutor, the CWC podcast, where we cover and discuss themes on pedagogy, language, higher education in universities, and all kinds of academic writing. In today's episode, we delve into one of the most emerging and exciting sectors of academic writing, namely science writing, communication, and journalism. Many of us probably suppose or presume that writing, its craft and style, is necessarily bound up with the humanities and cannot sit well with the scientific disciplines. And in this episode, we will attempt to chip away at some of those conventional notions. And we could not have more apt or experienced guests to guide us through these issues. Today, we are joined by Anil Ananthaswamy. Anil is a science journalist and a 2019-20 MIT Knight Science Journalism Research Fellow. He has been a deputy news editor and staff writer for the London-based New Scientist Science magazine. These days, he writes for Scientific American, Quanta, Nature, New Scientist, and other publications. Anil has also been a guest editor at the science writing program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and conducts the annual Science Journalism Workshop at National Center for Biological Sciences, TIFR, Bengaluru. He has authored 3 popular science books: The Edge of Physics, A Journey to Earth's Extremes to Unlock the Secrets of the Universe, The Man Who Wasn't There, Tales from the Edge of the Self, Through Two Doors at Once, The Elegant Experiment That Captures the Enigma of Our Quantum Reality. Anil's first book was The Edge of Physics, and it was voted as the Book of the Year in 2010 by UK's Physics World. His second book, The Man Who Wasn't There, was longlisted for the 2016 Penn E. O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His most recent book is Through Two Doors at Once. It was named one of Smithsonian's favorite books of 2018 and one of Forbes' best books about astronomy, physics, and mathematics in 2018. So welcome, Anil. And we are also joined by Anusha Krishnan. Anusha Krishnan is a freelance bioscience writer and editor with a PhD in ecology from the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. She largely writes on biology and ecology related topics for popular news sites such as Mongabay India, Scroll, The Wire Science, and she also runs a side hustle editing academic manuscripts and books. She conducts workshops on academic and popular science writing as part of the CWC's annual winter school. In fact, she just did that the last winter school we had. So lovely to have you here as well, Anusha. And I think if we can just get into the conversation straight away, maybe first I can have a response from you, Anil, and then we can go on to Anusha about the question of how exactly does one differentiate between science communication, science journalism, and science writing? How are they different from one another? And could you give us some examples of how they could differ?
Yeah, firstly, thank you for having me on this podcast. I think those categories, they are not cut and dry, but I think the way to think about it is science writing is usually, I think of it as writing that is done by experts in the field who are writing about work that they have done or that they know about. There's no reporting involved, no journalism involved. So think about books written by people like Carl Sagan or Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, for the lay public, right? So this is that would, in my mind, come under the rubric of science writing. Or, for instance, books in India written by someone like Raghavendra Gadakkar. He writes regularly these days for The Wire, and so that, in my mind, is science writing. Science communication is a more general thing where usually it's communication about science coming out from institutions, whether it's the Indian Institute of Science or the or NCBS, the National Center for Biological Sciences, their press offices writing about work that's going on in the institutes. Um, Science journalism is really first and foremost journalism. So it's no different from journalism that you would see for other subjects, whether it's finance or entertainment or anything like that. The thing is that it happens to be journalism about science. Uh, but the key thing is that journalistic science, science journalism is not associated with institutions. It is not on the side of any particular academic, uh, or institution, and it is really considered independent and should be. So that would be my way of thinking about it.
Anusha, do you have any ways that you uh, differ from Anil, or how do you see these categories yourself?
Thanks, Uday, for having me on this show. So Anil actually has quite clearly defined what science writing, science journalism are. I would say, though, that science communication is kind of an umbrella topic that encompasses these two. Plus, it also has a very broad a very broad usage, in the sense that science communication is not just about science writing. There's a lot more that can happen in science communication. For example, there's a lot of communication that happens through social media. There is a lot of very interesting science communication that happens through videos, through what you're doing right now as podcasts, through illustrations. So I'd say that science communication is probably the umbrella topic within which there can be many, many, many different types of ways of outreach. And science journalism and science writing kind of fall under that umbrella topic of science communication.
Right.
I think that's a very good point. Keeping in mind that it's not just writing we are talking about when it comes to communicating science.
Well, that's an interesting perspective to start with, and I think the as we go into it, the next question I think will interest most of the Ashoka students, I can imagine, as they delve into a lot of writing, especially in their first year. And so, what I wanted to know was writing about science is more than summarizing a research paper or simply retelling the facts, figures, and results and numbers. Uh, can you tell us the importance of writing style or the usage of language while writing articles in science, and how do you look at that aspect? How do you modify or think about your own language while you're writing, or does it not enter into the equation at all, feel? Anil, if we can start with you.
I think language is extremely important for communicating. And when I teach my workshop in at NCBS, I keep telling my students that science is about doing things in a precise way, and writing about science also requires the same kind of precision. But that precision comes from the correct use of language, and you really, really have to be good at the way you use language. But it's not just about being good in terms of knowing how to use the precise words or precise language. It's also about being able to tell stories. So you are really fundamentally trying to communicate extremely complex ideas through the use of language. And for me, the first and foremost thing that a science writer or a science journalist has to keep in mind is that they really have to know how to tell stories. And that's not to, story by stories, I don't mean lighthearted fluff. It's basically a way of organizing your thoughts in a way that makes for a coherent story and grabs the reader and keeps their attention, and at the same time conveys all the information that you want.
So the framework of narrative or story, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that you described, is something that the science writer should keep in mind, you'd say.
I would say in the traditional sense also, the notion of a story, a narrative, is the same whether you're thinking about fiction or non-fiction or science or finance. So the elements of storytelling are the same across the board, and it just, depending on the actual subject matter, you might choose different elements to convey your ideas, but storytellers are pretty much the same across the board.
Anusha, how do you deal with this theme?
So I agree very much with Anil with what he said, and I'd like to add to what he said. He also taught us during his NCBS workshop about how, as a science writer, especially a science writer who's trying to explain science to the lay public, you need to be very careful about whether you present an accurate picture versus a precise rendition. So that is something that is fairly difficult for a lot of people, especially those who have shifted from the traditional science communication of writing academic papers to the more recent forms of science communication, which is writing for the lay public. And here is where I believe I had quite a lot of trouble, because sometimes I would just get so caught up in how beautifully a paper's been written and their details of an experiment and the data. All of these are things that, as a former scientist, I absolutely love. But then these things are not exactly going to make for a very good story if I start including all of these things in, because the lay public may or may not agree with me about the beauty of that data. So in one way, I could write, a piece, a scientific communication piece, which is extremely precise. It talks about how an experiment was done and would give all the details of all of the experiments and the data and wax eloquent about all of that. But at the end of the day, the person who's reading that piece needs to come away with an accurate picture of what that science was about. Now, even if I've given them all of the details, if they're so confused that they can't figure out what that scientific piece was about, I've failed as a science communicator. So yes, the language is very important. The writing style is very important. And it's also very important to keep in mind that while writing, you need to be able to convey an accurate picture of the science versus, how much detail and how precise you've been in actually communicating that science. Also, to add on to the previous question, I just realized that academic writing also comes under the ambit of science communication. It's just not something that's talked about, but yes, it does come under the ambit of science communication also.
Well, I think the topic of narrative and the invocation of the term story inevitably brings us to the question of what should one keep in mind while reporting topics that are controversial in nature, or those where there are contradicting views on the same topic, or some topics where there is a cult-like growth of popularity. So let me use this as a segue to ask what's your opinion on the science communication and journalism that one saw being done by various parties during the COVID 19 pandemic, especially in the context of misinformation and fact checking, since Anusha mentioned how language can also not only explain but also obscure some things. So, as science journalists or communicators, how do you go about maintaining that balance, and how do you go about fact checking and preventing misinformation? And if you could say a bit about how can budding science writers steer away from misinformation so that a, that precision is achieved, and b, the gap between scientists and other members of the society can be bridged a bit.
I think it comes down to the integrity of the journalist and reporter. They, first of all, you need to really understand your subject, the whatever it is that you're reporting on, whatever it is that you're writing about. So sometimes it's going to take a lot of work to get beneath the subject matter and understand it well. You really have to do, and if depending on how complex the topic is and how controversial the topic is, you really need to do your reporting. So you have to be able to talk to enough sources that you start getting a good picture of what the issues are, and so that you can present it in a balanced way. So it's really up to the reporter and their editor to make sure that they have covered their bases. And finally it comes down to their personal integrity, their integrity and the integrity of the publications, to make sure that they are doing fact based reporting and writing.
Anusha, since you mentioned that sometimes language has a sway that covers up some important factors in science writing that are otherwise important. So I was wondering, how did you see this whole controversy unfolding about the misinformation surrounding COVID-19 or even other scientific topics like, for example, the famous flat Earth theory, things like that? I mean, uh, what are your views on how that could be handled by budding science writers, especially since we saw in some circles that science articles themselves were used to further misinformation and so on?
Okay, let me start off by, I think your question, one of the first questions was how, what were your opinions on the science communication and journalism that happened to tackle the, misinformation that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I believe that there was a consortium of scientists who got together. They called themselves the Indian Scientists Response to COVID-19, ISRC. They started as a very nice group of people who put out some very important information, and they did this in so many different ways. They had podcasts, they had radio shows, they have a website, they have illustrations, many different ways to tackle the misinformation that was coming out in the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that was a wonderful initiative. And there were a lot of scientists who were involved in this. And I would love to see that being taken forward, though I see that it's kind of fallen off since since the pandemic has waned, at least in India. Apart from that, when you're talking about how we go about with fact checking, usually when I try to do my fact checking and I try, and this happens along the whole process of writing, I try to go to the source itself, which means that I usually try to dig up the publication, the scientific publication itself, look up the papers that have been published in journals where things where things have been claimed, and I try to look at whether the data actually does support this. So I do a lot of in-depth digging to make sure that if I cite a scientific fact in any of my pieces, that they are very well supported. The other thing is, like Anil said, I talk to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of scientists to make sure that the facts that I have on hand are correct, that I have made no mistakes in interpreting these. And this is something that, I had to do in depth when I reported on this device called the Shikocan, which came out right bang in the middle of the pandemic. And this device was touted to be able to kill the COVID-19 virus. So there was a lot of scientific muddling happening over there. So these people were using scientific jargon to sell their device and to confuse people into thinking that there was a scientific basis to how the device worked. And despite the fact that there was a lot of scientific outcry against it, there were a lot of major places like NDTV and a lot of other news sites that spoke about the Shikocan, and I didn't see any background checking that these guys had done to ensure that that device was actually working the way it should have. So I could see that you could see a very clear imbalance in the way science was being reported. On the one hand, there were all these scientists, and there were a lot of other news sites who were being extremely careful with what they reported, versus there were also a bunch of news sites who just didn't care, or they just wanted to be sure that they captured the important news or whatever current news that was happening. And there was a lot of muddling that happened during the pandemic. So that's my experience with the way science was being communicated during the pandemic in India.
Going on that topic a bit further, I think there are, of course, so many contradicting views on some of the topics that the science world deals with, that sometimes the journalistic impulse of giving each side the weight a balanced fair weight can sometimes spill into doing really a misjudged science journalism, or uh, really putting yourself into a very dubious territory with regards to facts and figures and so on. So, if I and I know that Anil and I briefly talked about this before in one of our meetings, but uh, Anil, you said something about not giving weight where that side of the story doesn't deserve weight. So let's say if there's a flat Earth conspiracy, and it doesn't, then the writer then should not be misguided by the impulse of giving equal weight to the other side to the story. Could you explain that section a bit further for anyone who might be indulging in science writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Traditionally, when it comes to balance in journalism, when there are opposing points of view, the tradition has been to give what is called equal column inches to both sides, right? So that both views are represented in the story. But I think doing that, doing taking that approach to provide balance in certain aspects of science can be more harmful than otherwise. For instance, uh, take stories about climate change, right? It's a scientific fact now that climate change is real. So trying to write a story where you're providing balance by having half the column inches devoted to talking about climate change and half the column inches devoted to climate change deniers doesn't do society or the truth any service. And there are many topics like that. But it finally also comes down to the science reporter, journalist being really up to date and aware that they are making the right call, right? Even the judgment call that you have to make to say that I'm not going to devote equal column inches to a climate change denier has to be based on the fact that you understand the science well enough to do that with confidence. So it takes a lot of knowledge and reporting, etc., to come to that point. But there are certainly cases where you do not want to be taking the traditional view of balance when it comes to reporting about such certain aspects of science. Evolution versus creationism is another one. There are plenty, but where the science is established and the evidence is strong, a science journalist should be on the side of evidence.
Anusha, would you like to add anything to that?
Not much. I think the what Anil has said in terms of theories, that where it's very clearly proved that one theory or one aspect of a controversial topic is clearly much more scientifically supported than the other. There's not much of, at least for me, it's not much of you know it doesn't take me a lot of time to make a decision on whether I want to even give any space to one theory versus the other. On the other hand, you can also have other topics which are controversial and where perhaps there is a lot of data to support either viewpoint. For example, this whole issue of global reforestation, global tree restoration potential. So that's a very interesting topic where there is a lot of pros and cons to the issue at hand. There are a lot of people who support it. There are a lot of people who do not support it. And currently, this topic is a very hot, very contentious topic. On the one hand, we do need the trees because they will help with climate mitigation. On the other hand, the way that people are proposing that this reforestation happens is perhaps not the best way to go forward, because a lot of land on the earth are also covered by grasslands, and they have their own unique ecosystems. And if you just plant a bunch of trees over there, it's still going to mess with the balance in ecosystems. So given such topics, it's very important for us as science journalists to be able to give a balanced view of both sides.
Right.
I think that's a very good point, right? I mean, so the basic idea here is that the science journalist should be very clear that when they are reporting on something, when they're trying to write about some topic, in the case of the example that Anusha just brought up, the data is ambiguous, right? I mean, so there is no scientific consensus, and so both sides have a point to make, and as a journalist, you cannot take sides at that point.
I think that's an incredibly nuanced note to view this situation through. And I think with that, we can segue into one of the themes which holds particular importance for the Center for Writing and Communication, which is the pedagogical importance of imparting these skills of writing, especially science writing. Anusha, you've been part of CWC's Winter School, and Anil, you've been part of a science writing program. So I was wanting to know, since you both have been involved in, imparting certain skills of science writing through workshops and such like for students, how do you view the Indian education system or curriculums um, all through higher education institutions in terms of their ability to impart the skills one needs to communicate the science they practice or writing academic papers about science? Do you think that there's something that can be done to improve it pedagogically speaking?
In general, the overall education system, I think, still has a long way to go in terms of creating the right environment for nurturing people who can think like writers, and particularly science writers, because that requires a certain kind of analytic thinking that kind of, that goes along with the other aspects of writing. Um, but so I at this point, I think the overall education system is a long way from producing uh, people at some massive scale to be able to do this. There are always people who are good at all this despite the system, and those are the ones, I think, that come up and eventually do these kinds of things. Right. But from an individual's perspective, regardless of what the education system is telling you or not telling you, I think from an individual's perspective, the best thing you can do to be a good writer or a good communicator is to read from a very, very early stage, to read good writing, and read all sorts of writing, but good writing, whether it's science or fiction, it doesn't matter. And somewhere your brain figures out what good writing is without even being explicitly taught what that is.
So a large amount of that uh, is an instinctive recognition of what a writing style is.
Yeah, as long as you're doing this early on, I think if you're starting to do this in your 20s, I feel personally that it's already a bit too late. uh, I mean, so what I'm talking about is just completely free from reading. That has nothing to do with your desire to become a journalist or anything like that. You are reading because you're enjoying good stories and good writing, and something gets wired up for you to be able to write well later on.
I think that's an extremely well made point. Anusha, what's your take on this? And do you have any thoughts on how can we try to correct this trend?
I'll be really frank and much more direct than Anil. And I'll just say that, in India, there is no university level formal training in science writing, whether it is academic writing or whether it is popular science writing. I have not come across any courses that actually at the university level that are offered to, let's say, PhD students or MSc students or even BSc students who ought to be able to choose this as an elective subject, but they're just not there. So India has a very long way to go in that sense that, we still have to build the base for this by starting to offer such courses.
Right.
Apart from that, Anil's point about reading widely, I don't know how kids would choose good writing versus bad writing. It's just that as a child, I've read indiscriminately, so I kind of understand what he means when he says that that reading habit should be there from a very young age. And so for me, the transition to science writing happened as a very natural extension of what I enjoyed very much, which was reading. It's almost like an addiction. I read all the time. And that has certainly helped with my career as a science writer.
Yeah, no, I think the point that Anusha was making about university level programs for science writing, I still think, look, you know, when I run this workshop, we get about 110, 120 applications per year for 10 positions in the workshop. And without a shadow of doubt, I can tell you that about 80 to 90 of those applications don't don't make the cut at all, right? So the competition really to get in for those 10 seats is between about 20 people, right? And what that's telling me is that no amount of university level, uh, college level programs are going to rectify a problem that is much deeper. And that problem is really at the level, at the school level. I mean, you really need kids to be learning how to read, how to write, without it being a chore. And that's what Anusha meant by reading indiscriminately. I mean, we read what we enjoy, and as long as you pick up the habit, you're not going to read bad stuff, because the process of enjoying reading is itself a filter. You enjoy good things, and over time you learn that you're enjoying certain types of writing because you are getting better and better at discerning good writing from bad, without anyone telling you what that is. And so our problems run deeper than university level programs.
A quick point, another point over there to add to what Anil said. It could also be a language barrier. India being as diverse as it is, it could also be that a lot of kids at younger ages are probably reading in their mother tongues, in the local languages, and they just don't have enough exposure to English, which may be the reason why they're not able to perhaps be better communicators in English. So I think it's also very important to expand science communication into local languages, which I believe is happening now in India.
Yes, I think that's an extremely good point. So, focusing on, it's one thing to say everyone should read, but if there is nothing to read, that doesn't help matters at all. So, there is also the problem of producing the necessary content in regional languages, which is beginning to happen. I know of efforts to produce science, popular science writing in Kannada, for instance. So, and I'm sure it's there in Hindi. That will be a big part of the change that is more than overdue.
I think both your points go a long distance in covering this theme, and I think especially with Anusha's writing sessions that she has done for the CWC in the winter school, um I'm glad to say that at least we have gotten off the mark. So I think towards as we move towards the conclusion of this conversation, I thought maybe it will be a good note to end on both your advice or suggestions to students in the Ashoka University and beyond about how do they find a foothold in science communication or science journalism. Is it necessary to have a formal training or a degree in the subject? And I was wondering if you could elaborate on this through maybe your own experiences. How did you get into the field? And for students who would like to explore this field as a career choice, where and how do you suggest they start? What pitfalls should they avoid? What advantages should they grasp with both hands?
My personal experience in getting into science communication was a very organic thing. It began because I was not able to continue with my academics career. And like Anil said, I had been reading for so long that the language and communication part of it was just ingrained into me. But despite, apart from all of that, I've also been doing a lot of digging up to see if there are courses and other resources that are available to students in India who want to take up science communication. And I found that there is an Indian Science Communication Society, which was started in 1994, I believe, and they offer a training course in science journalism. And this is something that I've not really heard of until I dug into all of this, because somebody contacted me and asked me, can you recommend a course that I can take up to learn about science journalism?
Right.
So yes, there are resources available currently with all the online courses that are coming up. There are so many options for people who want to get into science communication that people just need to do a quick Google search and you'll come up with a ton of interesting options. So yes, there are lots of resources available.
Anil, what do you think?
My sort of career in science journalism kind of began because I've always been interested in writing, and for a long time I thought that I would probably be writing fiction. I used to work as a software engineer, and at some point I discovered, and I loved science. I loved reading about science. I just loved the idea of science, but I never put two and two together, the love of writing and the love of science, until I met someone who was actually doing science journalism, and that was the change. I basically went back to study to get a degree in science journalism at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And then after that, it's just been one thing after another, and pretty much once I retrained myself, I completely switched over to writing about science. Regarding opportunities in India, like Anusha said, I think things are very different now than they were even 10 years ago. Like when we started the NCBS journalism workshop, there was very, very little on the horizon. But I think the ecosystem of science journalists and science writers and science communicators in India is much richer now, since then it was about 10 years ago. So there are opportunities both in terms of publications that will publish science stories, but also the fact that these days anyone can, we don't have to be restricted to information that's only from India, right? You could access, for instance, the Open Notebook website, and there is so much information there about how to be a science journalist, how to be a science writer, like professionals sharing their expertise. So there are lots and lots of such websites, and there are, and again, I reiterate the same thing, that there is a lot of good science journalism that is being published all the time, and all these things are online, and you just have to read. And that's one way to make sure that you understand what is expected of a good quality science journalist and science writer.
Well, I think that's an extremely good note to end the conversation on. I certainly hope that students of Ashoka have thought this endeavor to be as resourceful and enlightening as I found it to be. And I certainly hope that many people at Ashoka are pursuing science writing, are interested in it, and maybe this conversation will help some people finding their way along. So thanks a lot, Anil and Anusha, so much for your patience and for being available for this conversation. It was great to have you, and I'm really, really thankful that you could make time for this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Uday. This was a lovely experience.